All right, so today's topic is advocacy for board members. This is, again, part of that three-part series of our Organizational Standards Center of Excellence Board Training webinar series. And we're going to go ahead and jump in and talk about our agenda for today. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about why community action. And so I'm kind of prepping you on this part basically to let you know that I'm going to be prompting you all to engage through the chat window and let me know and want you to kind of consider why you're a part of community action. And so if you're a staff member or a board member, just want to kind of hear from you why you got into community action or why you serve on the Community Action Agency board. So I'll ask you to do that here in just a moment, but just to let you know that we'll be engaging in that conversation. Then we're going to talk about the board's role in advocacy and talk about what that means for a Community Action Agency board, and we're going to talk through some practical ways that a board member can advocate. So whether you are a staff listening in or a board member, these are some helpful tools that you can take to the board if you're a staff, or kind of encourage those to start happening. Or as a board member, you can incorporate these into discussion during your next few meetings. Also, we're going to talk about the importance of diversity and how that has a role in advocacy as well. And then we're going to talk about some next steps that you can take to kind of build up your advocacy agenda as a Community Action Agency board. So want to go ahead and call out this resource because we're going to be taking quite a bit of material from it today. CAPLAW, another national partner organization we work closely with, they're the Community Action Program Legal Services organization. They have developed in partnership with us a resource on board roles and responsibilities for nonprofit community action agencies. A lot of it is also applicable to public community action agencies as well, but it does target the nonprofit community action agencies more. CAPLAW is also going to be working on a resource for public community action agency boards, since those look a little bit different, and just kind of how those relate to the organizational standards. So just to let you know that this resource is out there. It's a full training resource. We're only taking pieces from it, but this is kind of a full series of trainings that you can conduct with your Community Action Agency board. It just came out within the last few months. So, like I said, I want to get some feedback from the audience here and want to know why you're here. So if you're a board member, want to find out what motivated you to join the Community Action Board, and if you're a staff member of a Community Action Agency, want to have you think about what motivated you to work for a Community Action Agency. And so if you'd like to share your response, I'll give you a moment to think about it and consider it. And then if you want to share your response, go ahead and enter in your chat box. You can enter it to all attendees if you want to, or you can just send it to me as the presenter. So I'll give you just a moment to think about that. All right, we have some responses coming in. So helping to give a voice to the voiceless is one response. Helping neighbors in need to help make a difference and be able to give back and learn as well. All right, thank you for sharing. Give you just another minute in case others want to share. All right, so basically kind of from the answers we received and from what we hear most people say with this is that there's some sort of connection to the mission of community action and to kind of the purpose and the services and the promise of community action. So as you're thinking about why you joined community action, whether in service as a board member or employed as a staff, generally these responses have something to do with a connection to helping people out of poverty or helping people who are in need. And so I want you to consider that as we talk about advocacy today, because that can really be sort of the basis of your advocacy agenda, either as a community action agency board member, even as a staff member, or just anyone that's connected to the mission of community action. So in starting this conversation, I want you to think also not only where you are at personally and why maybe you joined in this work in the very beginning, but think about where your community action agency is currently. So thinking about kind of your baseline, because the idea of this webinar is to get you thinking on how you can improve in advocacy and how the board can lead that. Of course, staff can have a role in that as well. But think about where is your agency at currently. So think about where is the board at currently, and then also think about where the agency overall is at currently along the continuum between service delivery and advocacy. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go forward. But basically, in the very beginning of community action, it really started off as community action being this community catalyst and being really involved in helping low-income individuals have a voice in the community, as well as the idea of maximum feasible participation. And the Community Action Agency Board is really built on this as well, as we have that tripartite structure. But over time, we've shifted a little bit on this continuum more towards a focus on delivery of services. And so want to just encourage, and I think the movement is toward right now encouraging people to kind of get back toward that community catalyst idea, re-emphasizing that as well as the role in advocacy. And so just want you to think about kind of where is your agency at on that continuum and with your advocacy efforts currently. So I'll give you just a couple of seconds to think about that. Maybe jot a note down. You can visualize that continuum, mark your place on it. Okay, so now that you've considered that, I want you also to think about what's the single most impactful thing that you've done as a board or as a board member to advocate, educate, or raise awareness about your agency and your community action's anti-poverty mission. So even if you're not a board member and you're listening in as a staff member to try to help relay some of this information, think about what your board has done, and what you're aware of that the board has done to advocate, educate, and raise awareness of community action. So in knowing those things, that's kind of where you're able to consider your baseline and determine where you're starting off with advocacy as we think about what can be done as we go through this webinar. So in some of the previous webinars that we had discussion around board development, recruitment, board capacity, we talked about some of these key skills for board members, and this is also in that CAPLA toolkit on board training and orientation. So as you can see here, there's several different key skills. So obviously you look for skills when you're recruiting board members around maybe finance, legal expertise, fundraising, administration, maybe some research, as well as advocacy and outreach. And so two of the ones we're really going to focus in on today are fundraising and advocacy and outreach. And so these are two that really go into how is the board connected within the community, how are they advocating for the organization, both in the short term as well as in the long term. So obviously you're going to want people on your board that have those key skills in those areas. And just kind of a backtrack to previous webinars we did talk about with board recruitment, and this will come through our webinar today a couple times, that there are several resources on developing your board recruitment matrix. And so you can kind of plan out who all you need on your board, what different skills you have currently, what different skills you might be lacking, so that you're able to really be proactive and plan thoughtfully about the diversity of your board, both in skill and expertise, as well as in demographics as well. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. So traditional roles of the tripartite board, as I mentioned a couple slides ago, this is something that is really rooted in the history of community action, is this idea of the tripartite board with the 3 different sectors. And hopefully most of you are aware of that. We have lots of other training resources on the tripartite board. But you have the low income representation, you have the private sector of community partners, and then you also have that part of the board that's the elected officials or their representatives. And so, we talk about these different governance roles of the Community Action Agency Board. And the one main undercurrent that is not often as emphasized when we talk about roles and responsibilities is advocacy. And so this is really essential to effective development, planning, implementation, as well as evaluation. And also, it's very key to being fully engaged in these functions. And so as your tripartite board administers the CSBG funds through your community action agency, this full engagement in these pieces, not only in just governance and that kind of operational aspect of things, but really in how is the board really furthering the mission of community action and connecting the agency within the community. So there's various ways that a board can be fully engaged and advocate. And so these are 3 that we're going to walk through today. There's more than this, but for the purposes of a webinar and trying not to spit out too much information at you, we're going to kind of keep it simple to these 3 different areas, and then we're going to follow up on that with talking a little bit about diversity. So communicating the mission is one very key piece, which we've already kind of talked a little bit about. Also engaging the community. And then lastly, generating funds is another important way to advocate. So communicating the mission is the first one we want to talk about. And this is really just about how do we talk about community action? How do we talk about the purpose and your own agency's mission? And how does that connect with what's important in the community, and how are we making that real to people? So in communicating the mission, the history of community action is really deeply rooted in the commitment to raising awareness of and mobilizing communities to address the causes and condition of poverty. So it's not just about what the Community Action Agency can do, but how do we empower those that are in the community? How do we empower our customers to do some of this awareness building and mobilization themselves as well? So the board really has a key function in that, and the boards of community action agencies were really specifically designed to represent and raise up the voice of the community. And so communicating the mission is very key to raising up this voice. And over time, community action has kind of shifted, like I said earlier, away from more of the community organizing, community catalyst role, and advocacy to focus on that service delivery piece. And this is not to say that service delivery is not important, because it very much is. But we want to make sure that we're growing the community, that we're building it, and that we're communicating that mission of community action as well, because that's going to help support the services that are being delivered. So with this kind of shift, and this can lead boards to emphasize more on that traditional oversight through governance at the expense of community engagement, education, fundraising, and advocacy. So we want to make sure that there's a balance of the emphasis on these different pieces as far as the board's role in governing the agency. So ultimately, we do this work because we believe in something. And so that kind of circles back to the questions I asked in the very beginning, is why did you join community action, whether in service on the board or through employment? And ultimately, the responses all kind of fall within this category, usually, in that, people do this work because they believe in something. And so they usually believe in something related to anti-poverty efforts, strengthening the community, helping those in need, helping people reach self-sufficiency, and so on. And so when it comes to advancing our important missions and goals, one of the most useful assets that we have available to us is something that is woefully underutilized, and that is our voice. And so that's really how we work to communicate our mission, is through our voice and through other written materials and being out there in the community. And so boards really have that special opportunity to serve as powerful champions for the mission of the Community Action Agency. And so a lot of this information in this segment comes from a toolkit from Stand for Your Mission. And so you see the website there down on the bottom of the slide, standforyourmission.org. And they have a Powers of Board Advocacy discussion guide, and I would recommend checking that out. It's a good resource, has some different questions that can be asked of the board, kind of help guide through these discussions on maybe refocusing on advocacy, community engagement, and that sort of thing. And really just give that boards an opportunity to talk about how they can be a champion for the mission in the community that they serve. So, of course, I think this is important to cover, and everyone's always concerned about, well, we can't lobby, and some people even think, well, we can't advocate, but you actually can advocate as a Community Action Agency board member, even as a Community Action Agency staff, and the thing is that there is a difference. You cannot lobby, so that is correct in thinking, but you can advocate, and that is because advocacy is really, it's kind of that umbrella advocacy is, and lobbying is one piece of advocacy that focuses specifically on influencing legislation. And so that's the piece that with federal dollars we cannot do. But with advocacy, these are really kind of actions and communications that educate in an attempt to influence public policy. So kind of in an indirect way without specifically asking for some influence on legislation. Then, advocacy really looks at using voices as committed and informed champions for the mission. So exactly what we just talked about on the previous slide. Then also it kind of reminds decision makers of shared values and beliefs. It can help share tested solutions to community problems. And then advocacy can also help community leaders understand the impact of their decisions. And so these are kind of the key purposes behind advocacy, as well as how you can use advocacy in contrast to lobbying. And an example here on lobbying is really basically where you're asking specifically for legislators to support or oppose specific legislation, or asking the public to urge their legislators to do so. And so making those specific calls for action is, something that is considered influencing legislation. And so that's where the line is generally drawn. But to simply let people know what community action is, how we are champions of our mission, what those shared values and beliefs are, what those promising practices are to community problems, as well as, potentially what the impact of decisions could be, is simply education and advocacy. So there's a little bit more information here in this toolkit. And then, of course, Community Action has some additional resources specifically related to community action that would be recommended to look at in this area as well. But the bottom line is here, you can advocate, you just cannot lobby with federal dollars. So some different steps that you can look at to using the mission of your organization to really start to identify your advocacy role as a board. Because really the question here is, how do we really do this? And so here's some different steps here that you can walk through as a board to identify what your role in advocacy needs to be. So first, you need to have a shared vision for the future. And generally, it's required by the organizational standards that Community Action Agency boards do have both a mission and a vision for their organization. So you can kind of start with discussing, is your vision on track? Is this the shared vision for the future? And if not, does it need to be updated? Then I think along with that is also, what does that mean? So how do we start to maybe communicate that to people? Does the community share that same vision as well. Then, you know, we really need to think about how do we develop a deeper understanding of the work. So are we informed as board members to be able to go out and talk about this sort of thing in the community? You know, do we need to know a little bit more about community action, about our agency? And then what are those things that we need to know to be able to develop that deeper understanding? And then we need to decide where to start. So what type of activities do we want to start with as far as advocacy for the board? And next, you want to leverage the power of partnership. So looking in your community, thinking about who else has similar missions as the community action agency, and who do we need to be talking with and partnering with. Because a lot of times that can be a somewhat easy way to advocate and get awareness out there for community action, is talking to others in the community that are doing similar work. And they should all know about community action. And so likely you're having, within your board, there's going to be partnerships that are already there, because you're going to have representatives from various community partner organizations. You're going to have people on there that know other organizations that maybe, you know, people should be talking to. So you can really leverage that piece within the board, especially with that tripartite structure, to make sure you have those good connections within the community. Then also making advocacy a part of your board's culture. And so I think that one of the first steps I can think of on this part is just simply making advocacy a part of your board meeting agendas. So making sure that it's worked into the board meeting agendas on a regular basis, incorporating it into the strategic plan of the organization, and that sort of thing. So it has to be something that's on one of the front burners, not just kind of in the background for the organization and for the board. So the guide that I was talking about goes further into these different 5 steps. And so you can look further at those and identify how to work through those as board. So I talked through those 5 steps, but you still probably are asking, but how? Like, really, what are those practical steps that we can take to actually be an advocate as a board member? And so these are some different fast and easy ways to be an advocate. So it doesn't mean that you have to go develop some giant campaign in your community. You know, there's really some easy, brief areas that you can focus in on. So these are all things that can be done within an hour or less. And this comes from a toolkit that's the Agency Advocacy Toolkit from Philabundance. Philabundance.org is where that resource can be found. And so within 15 seconds, you can share an article or blog post about a current issue related to community action to your friends and followers on social media. And then in 1 minute, you could make sure you're ordering voter registration forms for your, for your area, and make sure that people are involved in that sort of thing. You could also just make sure you're participating. A lot of state networks have legislative days or advocacy days. So just making sure that you are participating in those events, that you're talking to your local elected officials, and just letting them know what community action is. Maybe give them some information on a specific program. Maybe let them know about some type of community solution that you're starting to work on. Or, maybe there's a lot of data that came out from your recent community needs assessment that you feel like they need to know about. And so simply sharing that data with them and how it impacts the community. And then there's some others on here, of course, that you can read through, and just making sure that you're just talking about community action and meeting with the people who are making those decisions. And again, it's about the education piece, not making those specific asks to influence legislation, which is considered that lobbying piece. And then the other piece here, too, that I want to talk about is data and storytelling. So making sure that we are using a balance of data and stories as we talk about community action. We do want to use those real stories of people with lived experiences. Of course, those can tug on the heartstrings of people. They can make an impact on how people think about community action and the solutions it can generate. But you also want to make sure you have permission to use those stories. And then you want to pull that data from your community needs assessment that may relate to those stories. So that's kind of how you can create that balance of information to share. So there's some different, tips that you want to make sure you're thinking about. You want to be respectful, avoid reinforcing stereotypes. So with those two, it's probably best to get information directly from participants. Try not to paraphrase or write too much in your own words, because you want it to be real and come from that person with the lived experience. Also use consent and permission forms just to make sure you're protecting your organization, matching your data to stories, so you make sure that those are in sync. Keeping it simple. People don't have a lot of times, especially elected officials, to read lengthy documents. Sometimes those can be kind of a turnoff. And so making sure that you're kind of keeping it short, keeping it simple, maybe even visual with infographics, and then just making sure, of course, that you're using reliable data. And so this agency advocacy toolkit goes further into these different tips and making sure that you are building your case through data and storytelling. So the next piece I want to talk a little bit about is engaging the community. And being fully engaged in the organization means that board members not only meet their fiduciary duty of care to make well-informed, reasonable decisions, but also that they help the organization with its effort to connect with the community it serves. And so being connected with the community is important. So this is kind of an exercise in a live training. We would do this with the participants, but I want you to just kind of think through these different sentences as I talk through, why it's important to connect with the community. And this is something you could do with your local community action agency board, is walk through this exercise. And really, kind of the purpose behind it is, the community action agency garners the support it needs to survive and thrive if it's connecting with the individuals and families it serves, as well as others in the community who can support the furtherance of community action's mission. So connecting with the community really embodies the hallmark of community action, which is that maximum feasible participation piece. And so, the low-income community is really raised up and empowered through that. The Community Action Agency Board is ultimately the face of the organization and must ask itself how it is engaging in activities like the ones that are listed here on the slide. So examples of how board members can connect with the community include empowering the low-income community by spearheading a leadership development program for community action agency clients. We've actually done a recent peer-to-peer webinar on that topic, and so that can be accessed through our website about how community action agencies can facilitate those leadership development programs for community action customers. And the Tripartite Board developed, of this example, the Tripartite Board developed a program that not only connected the board with the population that community action serves, but also helped to educate those who often feel voiceless as how they can make their voices heard and then produce those results, hopefully benefiting themselves as well as the community. You can also advocate for the organization by speaking at community groups and participating in hearings on matters impacting the low-income community. You can collect and provide input on community needs by holding forums, seeking feedback from the community as to their needs and what assistance they believe will help in addressing those needs. Also developing and sustaining strategic partnerships and collaborations by working with other social service providers who are serving that same community to determine what are the best ways that we can individually as well as collaboratively help improve the lives of the low-income community. So this little assessment here can be done to determine, what we're currently doing as a community action agency or a tripartite board, and then that can kind of help you determine where to go from here and what you might need to start doing in these different areas. And just to tie this back to some of the organizational standards on community engagement, since these can kind of guide our efforts as well. A lot of times the board is not, ultimately the board is not directly involved in complying with those CSBG organizational standards, but they support the compliance of those, even though they're not doing some of those activities. There's a number of ways boards can directly contribute to a community action agency's effort to meet these standards through deliberate efforts that connect to the community that's served. So in Organizational Standard 1.1, the organization needs to demonstrate low-income individual participation in its activities. There's several different ways a community action agency can do that. Also, Organizational Standard 2.1, the organization has to document and demonstrate partnerships across the community for specifically identified purposes. Partnerships include other anti-poverty organizations in the area. And then 2.3 says that the organization communicates its activities and results to the community. So as you can see, we already talked through many of these different areas as far as data and storytelling, making sure you're communicating its activities and results to the community, making sure you're considering leveraging those partnerships that you have in the community as part of advocacy efforts. And then the idea of maximum feasible participation. How are we showing that low-income individuals are participating and we're helping them to lift up their voice ultimately. And next is generating funds. So this is, ensuring fiscal soundness of a nonprofit community action agency is not only a key board responsibility, but it's a critical one. So sometimes this is the one that some boards don't know where to start in this area. Sometimes this can be kind of a nerve-wracking task to be involved in. But the Community Action Agency Board is ultimately responsible for the agency's survival, and that survival is tied to having sufficient funds to be able to operate and do so in compliance with the rules that govern federal and state funds. So we'll talk through a couple of questions that address the role of the board in generating funds in order to make sure that the organization remains sustainable. So ultimately, there's two main ways that a community action agency can generate funds. The most common way is through writing grants and preparing bid proposals, and federal grant rules that govern a community action agency's use of federal funds, uniform guidance, allow for agencies to pay for the costs that are associated with both preparing successful and unsuccessful bids, proposals, and applications on potential federal and non-federal awards or projects with federal funds, as long as certain requirements are met with regard to how costs are treated. So indirect costs, for example. And when they're charged to the grant, like during the accounting period in which they were incurred. Most community action agencies rely heavily on their federal and state grants and the executive director with staff to lead this effort to identify and apply for this type of funding. Then organized fundraising, which includes capital campaigns, special events, and solicitation of gifts and bequests, is another sometimes less common way that agencies generate funds. However, fundraising is a common activity amongst most nonprofits who have the history with government funds that agencies have been fortunate to have. And so fundraising costs may not be paid for with federal funds unless the federal award agency gives prior written approval to use funds for this activity. And so, but ultimately these are two pieces that are still important in generating funds. There's just rules on how funds can be used to engage in these different activities. So you'll want to make sure you check on those rules before you engage in, these activities, but both writing up proposals as well as fundraising are two pieces that can help to generate funds, fundraising being the one that the boards are most commonly involved in. So we're going to go through a little bit of a quiz on generating funds. So you can kind of test yourself and your knowledge as you're sitting there listening. So the first one is a community action agency cannot rely solely on its state and federal grants and should engage in efforts to generate unrestricted funds. Is this true or false? All right, so we did get one response in the chat, and it is true. So the reason why is that state and federal grants restrict the use of funds, and the diversification of funding is often essential for sustainability and flexibility. All right, another question here. Generating funds is mainly the executive director's responsibility, not the board's. All right, we had a chat come through that said false, and you are correct. It is false, and the reason why is that it is really a joint effort. So you saw that on a previous slide. Both bring different resources and skills. Generally with fundraising, that's something that is both the board and the executive director's responsibility. And then generating those proposals for grants a lot of times goes down to executive director and staff. But if there were no unrestricted funds, then the board must spearhead those fundraising efforts to make sure that funding is diversified and sustainability is intact for the long term. So this piece is important for both to be involved in and to discuss over time. All right, our last question here. Tripartite boards cannot require members to give financially to the community action agency because low-income representatives may be low incomes themselves. So true or false on that one? All right, we had a false come through the chat, and that is correct. So the reason why here is that there's no legal prohibition against soliciting funds from all board members. It allows for varying levels of giving, and non-financial ways to give is one way to do it. And then foundations often want to see 100% of board giving. So if you're applying to different foundations for funding, that can be a plus to make sure that board members are giving. But there's various ways that you can do that. So you can, have in-kind, monetary, various ways to give. All right, we just had somebody type in the chat. Thank you for giving some feedback. That's always helpful. Of course, I can't see the window very well. Here we go. Someone said that we require 100% giving, but we don't have a specific dollar amount that the board must give. So yes, that's another good way to do it. So that there's not that pressure, especially whenever we do have that tripartite structure and there's low income representation. Requiring an amount is going to be difficult, but keeping that open as well as allowing for non-financial is a good way to do that. All right, well, thank you for the engagement on those questions. So hopefully that helps you understand the importance of generating funds as well as some of the different requirements around that. But really kind of the purpose of including this in the idea of advocacy is that, there's advocacy on behalf of the agency's mission, the clients that are being served, but ultimately if the board is not fundraising and the agency is not sustainable in the long term with the diversification of funds, then, ultimately the agency may not be sustainable and may not last if there were to be, a cut in federal grants or whatever it might be. So if we really truly care about the mission of the organization and the purpose of community action, fundraising is really essential. And so that's one way that the agency can advocate for the sustainability and for the agency to carry on long term and be able to do good work is to make sure that they're financially secure and able to deliver those services effectively to the community and the individuals that are being served. So there's a lot of different ways that the board can engage in the role of fundraising. They can work with staff to develop a plan. So this would be kind of a fundraising or resource development plan that the organization might have. The board can also oversee implementation of the plan. So that would be just within, that could be a piece of the strategic plan. And then just as the organization is reporting to the board on progress they're making on the strategic plan, they would report on the progress that they're making with their advocacy or resource development plan for that accountability. Also, the board can help identify potential funders. So maybe board members know funders that are tied to the mission of community action. Maybe they have connections in certain areas, and that can always be helpful. Also, organizing and participating in special events. So this is the piece where you really start to see advocacy shine through, is that, you know, if the board is out there, if the awareness is out there in the community of what community action does, if people understand the purpose of the mission and are tied to it, then, you know, and that's one way to do that is through organizing and participating in special events. And then people are going to be more likely to give through potentially those events or in other ways if they're aware of community action. And then, of course, similarly, developing and nurturing relationships. If you have relationships with people, if people see community action in a good light, are aware of it, then they most, you know, would be more likely to give. So these are all ways that, and some of them fairly simple, like developing and nurturing relationships, that the board can have a role in fundraising. They can also give themselves, but these are ways that it can be done, not just through giving through funds. Okay, so hopefully as we kind of think back to those three areas before we go into diversity, hopefully that kind of makes sense as a package. So you've got communicating the mission, so making sure that you're being that voice in the community for community action. You've got engaging with the community, so making sure that the board is connected to the community, and then of course that can in turn communicate the mission, and then that piece of generating funds. So there again, it's all kind of interrelated. If people are aware of community action, if they connect to the mission of community action, and they see community action connected to the community, then fundraising is going to ultimately be easier. And so the board members can play a role in all of that even simultaneously. And ultimately, then all of it can work together to both benefit community action in the short term as well as the long term. So the other piece of advocacy that we want to talk about today is the importance of diversity. And so this quote here from the Scientific American, Catherine Phillips, she says that the fact is that if you want to build teams or organizations capable of innovating, you need diversity. Diversity enhances creativity. It encourages the search for novel information and perspectives, leading to better decision-making and problem solving. Diversity can improve the bottom line of companies and lead to unfettered discoveries and breakthrough innovations. Even simply being exposed to diversity can change the way you think. And so there's several reasons in here that we need to look at diversity, both the diversity of our community action agency boards as well as our organization. And so if the governance of the organization is coming through a diverse team of people on a board, then that would lead to all of these good things that you read through this quote. And so that's really where it needs to start at the top. And so not just the organization being diverse, but the board being diverse as well. And a lot of this that I'm speaking from comes from this resource from CAA Partners. It's a publication called The Governance Gap. And I would definitely recommend, they have lots of different research within this publication and information that is very applicable to not only why organizations sometimes kind of find themselves with a lack of diversity, but how do we then build on that as well. So, you know, ideally a community action agency board should be representative of their service area. But we find that a lot of community action agencies, as well as other nonprofits that have governance boards, are really not as representative at that governance level. And so there's these gaps that are being found at the staff and board level. And here, some of this data from this report says that people of color are currently 36% of the U.S. population and are expected to grow to 50% as early as 2042. and that potentially becoming that minority white by potentially 2045. According to Annie E. Casey Foundation, at least 60% of nonprofits serve people of color. And I think in community action, we definitely know that that is the case, and we know that there's a disproportionate amount of people of color who are in poverty. And so we know that that's a key audience of people that we are serving in community action. But multiple surveys are exploring diversity and representation at the staff level and showing that whites lead 9.5 out of 10 philanthropic organizations. And only 7% of nonprofit chief executives and 18% of nonprofit employees are people of color. And this is a very recent report. It just came out in January of 2019. And I know that we're starting to see some more diversity, but this is still showing that we're not quite there. And so if we're, very much, disproportionate as far as the representation of diverse cultures, races, ethnicities within our organization and at the governance level versus the demographics of those that we're serving, then we're not able to best represent and serve those people without this similar diversity. So this is just something to consider as you're thinking about those who are on the board, those who are in your staff, and then those that are in your community. How do those match up? And so that's something just to think about. And with this, it's not that people don't care. So this report talks about the why behind this. And the governance gap survey reveals that it's not because of the lack of understanding about why diversity is important. People generally agree on that, nor is it a lack of desire to be diverse. Instead, the survey that they conducted points to a lack of knowledge, skills, resources, and genuine commitment to change. And we all know that change is hard, especially organizational change. Whenever you're not just relying on change of one person, but of an organization of people. And it really comes down to organizational change at all levels, and ultimately board recruitment. So how are we recruiting for our community action agency boards? Are we recruiting the same way that we did several years ago? Are we looking at how we're recruiting for our board in relation to the demographics we find in our community needs assessment? And so on and so forth. So we talked about recruitment in an earlier webinar, and like I said, there's those different recruitment matrices that are out there. We've also promoted the idea of a board governance committee that takes on ongoing recruitment. And the thing is we should be looking for, a lot of what we talked about in that previous webinar was diverse expertise of skills for a community action agency board, making sure that that's present. So not only do we want to make sure that that is present, but that we have a diverse representation of demographics in relation to who the community action agency is serving. So we start with having a diverse board, and that's one of the ways that we can advocate for diversity in turn as well. And so we want to make sure our boards reflect the communities we serve so that we can best serve and best advocate for those who are in need. So again, I would encourage you to look at that resource that's linked there at the bottom on the governance gap for more information, as well as it has a lot of good kind of steps and things to do about it as you're working to kind of change that culture, both of advocacy as well as diversity for your organization and for your board. Okay, so as we're closing out, just a reminder, if you do have questions, feel free to send those in. But here are some practical next steps that your board can build on, or how you can begin to work on advocacy more. So hopefully you've identified kind of where your baseline is as you've kind of thought through on this webinar, or maybe you have some discussion points you want to take back to the board if you're a staff member. But one way you can start to build on this is to create an advocacy plan. So what is it that we want to do? First, you probably want to assess with the full board where you're at currently, and then to identify, what are those key priorities as far as advocacy for your board and for your organization. Also developing a policy agenda or strengthening an existing one. So what are those, what are the things that are going on in your local community, in your state, your agency cares about, and what would end up on that policy agenda. Then starting or supporting a campaign on a specific policy or issue. So even just looking to see what other organizations might be doing in your community and how can you maybe partner with them and leverage partnerships in maybe just even supporting a campaign. And that's one kind of easier way to get community action out there is to start partnering on certain issues with like-minded organizations. Then connecting with other collaboratives, coalitions, organizations, so making sure you're at the table where you're supposed to be at the table. Strengthening advocacy goals in the strategic plan, or simply making sure it's a part of the strategic plan is important as well. Engaging elected official and policymakers through different convenings, presentations, other outreach. This is an easy way that you could do some advocacy for your organization is just by simply, if your organization has open house events or different community events it holds, simply inviting elected officials. If they show up, then they get to learn about your organization, what your programs do, and maybe even engage with some of your constituents. Also, strengthening board capacity to engage in advocacy and fundraising efforts. So where do you maybe have skills and expertise in advocacy or fundraising, or where do you need those? So thinking about your recruitment efforts as well as training and capacity efforts too. And then ensuring you have the right people on your board. So that goes back to that training, recruitment matrix, looking at your diversity, looking at your skills and expertise. How can you increase the diversity, or how can you build capacity through training and recruitment efforts? Just a side note that one of those resources, the Fill Abundance Toolkit, does have an advocacy plan template. There's other resources out there as well that you can kind of get started with these in simple ways. All right, so we'll go through some different resources. These are the various resources we pulled from today to create this training. So again, you will have the slides available on the website, or I can send them to you after this webinar. And so you can access where these different materials came from and get kind of the fuller versions of those through these links. We also have several resources that the partnership has developed, either on our website or through our Community Action Academy. We've recently just had our Immigration Summit last week in El Paso, Texas. Went really well, and so we've got lots of resources and information related to that. We did a live stream event from some of the sessions there. We also are getting much more engaged in the Census 2020 work, making sure that all are counted. And so there's lots of information here on racial equity, immigration, census, and so really encourage you to go to our website because we've put a lot up recently. And so if you, there's a link down here at the bottom. If you go to communityactionpartnership.com, it's the resources for serving migrant families. And the resources go beyond that on this page as well, where you can get more racial equity resources too. And then we also, in general, as far as board training resources, we have our YouTube channel that has a playlist of board videos for organizational standards. So that's linked in here as well. These are all very short, as you can see, 3 minutes, 7 minutes, 6 minutes, knowing that board training time is sometimes limited with boards. And then we also have Roma for Boards training series that has similarly videos that are all about 20 minutes, as well as accompanying facilitation guides and PowerPoints that can be built upon for a more full training for the board. And they go through the whole Roma cycle, as well as an introduction and creating a local theory of change. And with that, right on time, we'll go ahead and close out the webinar. But if you have any questions, if you want a copy of the slides, the recording, feel free to email me, Courtney Kohler, Senior Associate with the Partnership. Then, of course, Darrell Crocker is our Director of Training and Technical Assistance, and he's always happy to answer questions as well. But we thank you for joining this webinar event today, and I encourage you to contact us with any questions or comments, and we hope you all have a great day.